What happened during the 1950s that transformed entheogenic plants and fungi from ethnographic curiosities into subjects of global scientific, philosophical, and spiritual fascination? The decade united physicians, psychiatrists, chemists, ethnobotanists, anthropologists, philosophers, artists, and seekers into a conversation that still shapes modern understandings of consciousness. The decade between 1950 and 1959 stands as one of the most remarkable periods in the history of consciousness research. During these years, laboratories investigated lysergic acid diethylamide as a model for psychosis, a catalyst for psychotherapy, and a possible doorway into mystical experience. Anthropologists and ethnobotanists ventured into indigenous ceremonial systems with growing academic interest, while philosophers wrestled with questions surrounding perception, symbolism, and the nature of reality. The boundaries separating medicine, religion, psychology, and comparative mythology began to blur as researchers encountered states of awareness that challenged existing scientific categories. Ancient spiritual systems preserved for centuries by Mazatec healers, Siberian shamans, and numerous indigenous cultures increasingly entered public awareness through books, journals, and eventually mass media. At the same time, intelligence agencies quietly explored psychedelics for entirely different purposes, revealing how the same compounds could become instruments for healing, revelation, manipulation, or control, depending on intention. New vocabulary emerged as scholars searched for language capable of describing experiences that exceeded ordinary perception. The decade also witnessed the rediscovery of sacred mushrooms, the isolation of their active principles, and renewed comparisons between living ceremonial systems and the mystery religions of antiquity. To understand the cultural revolution of the 1960s, we must first understand the remarkable foundation established throughout the 1950s. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K, or on Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. The early 1950s begin with psychiatry, not counterculture. In these years, the early entheogenic story begins to take shape inside hospitals and research centers, where LSD is explored as a treatment for mental illness and alcoholism. In 1950, Abram Hoffer was hired by the Saskatchewan government to develop a psychiatric research program. Saskatchewan's health system and Hoffer's chemistry background created an unusually receptive environment for experimentation, especially at Weyburn Mental Hospital. In 1951, Humphry Osmond joined Hoffer there, and the two began exploring LSD as a possible treatment for psychiatric disorders and alcoholism. This was one of the first sustained clinical programs in the Western world to treat a psychedelic substance as a serious medical tool, rather than a novelty. Chronologically, this is the real beginning of contemporary psychedelic psychotherapy. The logic behind the work was that a controlled altered state might loosen rigid psychological patterns and create the conditions for insight, emotional release, and behavioral change. That idea linked post-war psychiatry to older spiritual systems, in which crisis, ordeal, and purification can become transformative. It also reframed alcoholism as a condition that might be addressed biologically and psychologically, rather than only morally. Popular culture also reflected subtle shifts in symbolic imagination. Walt Disney's animated adaptation of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, released in 1951, was not created as a psychedelic film, since it preceded widespread public familiarity with LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. Nevertheless, its surreal transformations, shifting scales of perception, impossible landscapes, fluid identities, paradoxical conversations, and dreamlike logic would later resonate strongly with audiences interpreting the film through psychedelic experience. Lewis Carroll's 19th century narrative had always challenged assumptions concerning language, identity, and perception. During the psychedelic era, many viewers recognized striking experiential parallels, despite the complete absence of historical influence in the film's original production. This illustrates an important principle within comparative symbolism. Psychedelic imagery often converges with archetypal motifs already present in mythology, dreams, fairy tales, visionary literature, sacred art, and folklore. Rather than creating entirely new symbolic worlds, altered states frequently amplify structures already embedded within the human imagination. Jungian psychology, comparative mythology, and religious studies all observed similar recurring patterns, suggesting that visionary symbolism possessed remarkable cross-cultural continuity, regardless of whether it emerges through dreams, meditation, ritual initiation, or entheogenic experience. These early years matter globally because they show entheogens entering official medicine long before the counterculture made them famous. The research was still experimental and highly localized, but it established a model that would later influence psychedelic therapy across the world. By 1952, the field had not yet become public, but it had established the foundations for what would follow. The rest of the decade will turn that early psychiatric work into a wider cultural and spiritual phenomenon. Interest in LSD within medical circles was growing, and the substance was beginning to circulate in psychiatric discussion as something potentially useful for understanding the mind. The first phase of the decade is therefore about institutional emergence. Entheogens became a matter of clinical possibility. During these early years, the importance of the Saskatchewan work was not just therapeutic, but conceptual. Hoffer and Osmond were creating a framework in which altered states of awareness could be examined under controlled conditions, with preparation, dosage, and follow-up. The early 1950s therefore set the stage for a decade in which science and spirituality would repeatedly collide. By the end of 1952, the modern entheogenic archive had its first pillar, LSD as an experimental psychiatric tool. During the early 1950s, clinicians increasingly recognized that the effects of LSD depended on far more than chemistry alone. Researchers observed that personality, expectations, emotional preparation, physical surroundings, interpersonal trust, and symbolic interpretation profoundly influenced every session. Although the familiar phrase set and setting would not become widely established until later in the decade, its practical foundations were already emerging from careful clinical observation. In 1953, the entheogenic story leaves the hospital and enters literature. A mescaline session of that year would become one of the most important bridges between scientific experimentation and spiritual exploration. Humphry Osmond collaborated closely with Abram Hoffer in investigating both schizophrenia and the therapeutic possibilities of LSD and mescaline. Their biochemical theories proposed that schizophrenia might involve naturally occurring compounds related to adrenaline metabolism, an idea that encouraged experimental comparisons between endogenous mental illness and psychedelic states. Yet, as their investigations progressed, Osmond increasingly questioned whether psychedelics merely mimic psychosis. Many volunteers instead reported extraordinary clarity, emotional breakthrough, aesthetic sensitivity, and experiences possessing unmistakable spiritual significance. Rather than simply reproducing illness, these compounds often appeared capable of revealing hidden dimensions of reality and consciousness. Two major therapeutic schools gradually developed. The Psycholytic model, primarily advanced in Europe by psychiatrists including Ronald Sandison, employed repeated lower doses intended to loosen psychological defenses while allowing patients to verbally explore memories, trauma, dreams, and unconscious material over numerous sessions. The Psychedelic model, which would become especially influential in North America later in the decade, favored a single higher dose capable of producing an overwhelming peak experience that many participants described as mystical, transformative, or spiritually revelatory. These approaches reflected two complementary understandings of healing. One emphasized gradual analysis, while the other emphasized sudden illumination. Their philosophical differences echoed ancient initiatory spiritual systems. Certain mystery schools cultivated progressive purification through repeated rites, while others emphasized a singular initiatory encounter that forever transformed the initiate's understanding of existence. Even within psychiatry, the language of therapy increasingly intersected with archetypes of death, rebirth, purification, transcendence, and integration that had long occupied religious philosophy. Humphry Osmond stood at the crossroads between biological psychiatry and emerging transpersonal psychology. His work reflected a growing recognition that altered states could not always be reduced to pathology. Throughout human history, visionary states had served prophetic, initiatory, healing, and contemplative functions within countless cultures. Indigenous shamans, Vedic seers, Sufi mystics, Hesha caste contemplatives, Taoist adepts, and practitioners of tantric meditation all cultivated extraordinary states through different methods. Psychedelics appeared capable of opening experiences that resembled those long documented in spiritual systems, even though their pharmacological mechanism differed fundamentally from fasting, prayer, prolonged meditation, rhythmic drumming, breath disciplines, or ritual initiation. In May of 1953, Humphrey Osmond administered mescaline to Aldous Huxley in Los Angeles. Already renowned for his novels and essays, Huxley had spent decades studying comparative religion, Vedanta philosophy, Christian mysticism, Buddhist thought, Neoplatonism, and the perennial philosophy that he believed united humanity's great spiritual systems beneath their outward diversity. The experience became one of the most consequential moments in modern psychedelic history because Huxley possessed both philosophical training and extraordinary literary ability. Rather than describing intoxication, he sought to articulate changes in consciousness as a whole. His account emphasized intensified perception, radiant color, intrinsic significance, timelessness, and the dissolution of ordinary utilitarian awareness. Objects no longer appeared merely as functional tools, but seemed to reveal an existence possessing intrinsic value independent of human use. Huxley interpreted the experience through concepts already familiar from Meister Eckhart, the Bhagavad Gita, William Blake, Plotinus, and Eastern contemplative systems. He proposed that ordinary consciousness functioned as a reducing valve, filtering reality into manageable portions necessary for biological survival. Psychedelics, under appropriate circumstances, appeared capable of temporarily relaxing this filtration, allowing awareness to encounter aspects of existence ordinarily excluded from conscious perception. These reflections culminated in 1954 with the publication of The Doors of Perception, one of the most influential books ever written about psychedelic experience. Borrowing its title from William Blake's declaration that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite, Huxley connected chemistry with philosophy, art, religion, and metaphysics in a manner unlike any previous publication. The book introduced countless readers to the possibility that visionary experience could possess intellectual and spiritual legitimacy, rather than representing mere fantasy or illness. The sequel to Aldous Huxley's essay The Doors of Perception is the 1956 work Heaven and Hell, which expands on human consciousness, visionary art, and the nature of mystical experience. Huxley compared his observations with Buddhist suchness, Hindu concepts of ultimate reality, medieval Christian contemplation, and visionary art. He also distinguished genuine mystical experience from simple hallucination, arguing that perception itself had undergone transformation rather than merely acquiring imaginary content. His discussions resonated deeply with scholars of comparative religion because similar descriptions appeared throughout mystical literature across civilizations. Although Huxley remained cautious about equating psychedelic experiences with permanent enlightenment, he argued that these compounds could provide valuable glimpses into dimensions of consciousness ordinarily explored only through years of contemplative discipline. This perspective profoundly expanded public discussion beyond psychiatry toward philosophy, aesthetics, theology, and esotericism. In global entheogenic history, this is the year when altered awareness begins to look like a subject for public philosophy rather than only private experiment. Once the experience had been articulated, the next phase was to explain it in a way that avoided pathological language. In the next years, the terminology of the psychedelic field took shape. In December of 1955, Christopher Mayhew, a prominent British member of Parliament and TV presenter, famously ingested 400 milligrams of mescaline for a televised experiment. During the filming, Mayhew experienced profound alterations of awareness, famously stating that he had entered a state of existence outside time. Despite Mayhew being completely in favor of airing the footage, the BBC ultimately panicked. They consulted a panel of psychiatrists, theologians, and philosophers who deemed the experiment too controversial. As a result, the episode never aired on television at the time. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, experimented with LSD in the 1950s because he believed that it could help chronic alcoholics achieve a spiritual awakening and overcome ego-driven resistance to recovery. Guided by his friend Gerald Hurd and the psychiatrist Dr. Sidney Cohen, Wilson took LSD for the first time on August 29th of 1956 at the Los Angeles Veterans Administration Hospital. Wilson faced severe backlash from the Board of Trustees and the wider fellowship after experimenting with LSD in the 1950s to treat depression and spark spiritual awareness. Rather than being formally ousted, he voluntarily stepped back from active control and governing decisions within the movement's structure due to the intense controversy. Concurrently, Huxley and Osmond continued corresponding as both searched for language that adequately described these extraordinary experiences. Existing terms such as hallucinogen and psychotomimetic carried assumptions that increasingly seemed misleading. Hallucinogen emphasized deception, implying false perception. Psychotomimetic suggested imitation of psychosis, despite mounting evidence that many experiences possessed coherence, meaning, and therapeutic value. Huxley concocted the word phanerotime by combining the Greek words for to show and spirit, as well as the tagline, "To make this mundane world sublime, take half a gram of phanerotime." Osmond, however, came up with his own word, psychedelic. He combined the Greek words for psyche, or mind or soul, and delusion or show, along with his own rhyme. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. Osmond said the term meant mind manifesting, and that it was clear, euphonious, and uncontaminated by other associations. Much like a user drops acid, Osmond dropped the term psychedelic during a meeting at the New York Academy of Sciences in 1957. His appearance at the Academy was part of his effort to discuss his research in this area, which was published as a review of the clinical effects of psychotomimetic agents in the March 1957 issue of Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. The adoption of psychedelic represented far more than a semantic change. Language determines interpretation. By replacing pathological assumptions with a term emphasizing manifestation and revelation, researchers acknowledged that these substances could illuminate dimensions of consciousness rather than merely distort them. This shift paralleled broader movements within religious studies, where scholars increasingly sought to understand visionary systems on their own terms, rather than dismissing them as superstition or pathology. The brilliance of the term psychedelic was that it was broad enough to cover the frightening and the sublime at once, without reducing the experience to either madness or piety. In practice, this gave researchers, writers, and eventually the public a word that could hold the ambiguity of the experience while still sounding serious, elegant, and non-clinical. The effects of this interaction on global entheogenic history were enormous. The term psychedelic quickly displaced psychotomimetic in serious discourse, and that shift changed the public destiny of these sacraments by making them easier to discuss as tools of exploration, rather than as mere mimics of disease. Once the word existed, it could travel into psychiatry, anthropology, literature, music, art, and eventually counterculture, where it helped define an era of self-exploration and social transformation. Just as importantly, the term helped bridge modern chemistry with older spiritual vocabularies. If a substance is mind manifesting, then it can be compared to revelation, initiation, sacrament, or visionary ordeal, not simply intoxication. That made it easier for people to connect mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin to indigenous entheogenic spiritual systems, and to the global mysticism Huxley so admired, from Christian contemplation to Vedanta and Buddhist insight. The irony is that this optimistic framing emerged at the same time that governments were secretly exploring the same substances for coercive purposes, which means the word psychedelic was born into a world already split between liberation and control. In that sense, Huxley and Osmond did not merely invent a term, they helped define the moral architecture of the psychedelic age. Moving forward, the entheogenic story shifts from private philosophy to lived ethnographic encounter. This is the period where the mushroom path opens, and this leads to one of the most important public revelations of the decade in 1957. While psychiatrists and philosophers debated the meaning of psychedelic experience, another remarkable story was unfolding through ethnobotany. For decades, the existence of sacred mushroom ceremonies in Mesoamerica had been doubted or dismissed by many Western scholars, despite repeated references preserved in 16th century Spanish chronicles. Missionaries had described indigenous ceremonies involving sacred fungi, often referring to them by the Nahuatl term Teonanacatl, commonly translated as divine mushroom or flesh of the gods. Because these ceremonies had retreated from public view following centuries of colonial suppression and religious persecution, many academics assumed that the traditions had disappeared entirely. Yet, throughout remote regions of Oaxaca, Mexico, particularly among the Mazatec people, ceremonial mushroom rites continued to survive within carefully protected lineages. These ceremonies united healing, divination, diagnosis, prayer, and communion with the sacred into a single ritual framework. Participants did not understand the mushrooms as recreational substances, but as living mediators between the human and spirit worlds. The ceremonies unfolded during the night under strict ritual conditions, accompanied by prayer, chanting, invocations, and careful ethical preparation. Like the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, the Vedic Soma sacrifice, the Iranian Hauma liturgy, Amazonian ayahuasca ceremonies, or Siberian shamanic initiations, the mushrooms functioned within an integrated cosmology rather than as isolated pharmacological agents. The individual who brought these ceremonies to international attention was the American banker turned amateur ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson. Together with his wife, Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, an accomplished pediatrician born in Russia, he had spent years investigating humanity's cultural relationship with mushrooms. Their studies eventually developed into one of the foundational ideas of ethnomycology, the distinction between mycophilic and mycophobic societies. According to their observations, some cultures regarded mushrooms with affection, reverence, culinary enthusiasm, and symbolic importance, while others approached them with suspicion, indifference, or outright avoidance. Valentina observed that in Russia, mushroom gathering formed an essential part of seasonal life, folklore, and family heritage. Gordon contrasted this with many English-speaking societies, where mushrooms often inspired uncertainty or fear unless commercially cultivated. The Wassons proposed that these differing cultural attitudes reflected deep historical developments extending into mythology, language, ritual, and religion. Although later scholars would refine and sometimes criticize aspects of this framework for oversimplification, the mycophilic and mycophobic distinction encouraged researchers to examine mushrooms not merely biologically, but culturally, linguistically, and spiritually. It suggested that humanity's relationship with fungi might illuminate broader questions concerning symbolism, ecology, cosmology, and sacred tradition. After years of investigation, the Wassons finally gained access to a Mazatec Velada in the village of Huautla de Jimenez during 1955, under the guidance of renowned curandera María Sabina. The ceremony represented one of the first documented occasions in which outsiders participated in a traditional mushroom vigil, while attempting to understand it respectfully rather than suppress it. María Sabina understood the mushrooms as sacred children, or santos niños, capable of speaking through inspired language. Her ceremonial chants, often called the language of the mushrooms, invoked saints, spirits, ancestors, healing forces, and divine wisdom within a distinctly Mazatec Catholic synthesis. The Velada or vigil sought diagnosis, reconciliation, healing, and communion rather than entertainment. Wasson's accounts repeatedly emphasized the solemnity of the occasion, noting the darkness, silence, ritual structure, and overwhelming sense of sacred presence. Although later controversy emerged regarding the consequences of increased publicity for María Sabina and her community, the ceremony itself profoundly altered Western understanding of indigenous entheogenic spiritual systems. It demonstrated that visionary sacraments had survived into the modern world within living ceremonial contexts, rather than existing only as archaeological speculation or historical curiosity. Wasson's Velada with María Sabina turned a local Mazatec sacrament into a public story, and the Life magazine article turned that story into mass culture. Its impact on entheogenic history was explosive, helping launch the modern interest in psychedelics while also exposing indigenous peoples to appropriation, tourism, and harm. In May of 1957, these discoveries reached an enormous international audience through Wasson's landmark article in Life magazine titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom." At a time when Life ranked among the most widely read publications in the United States, millions of readers encountered detailed descriptions of sacred mushroom ceremonies for the first time. Wasson presented the Mazatec tradition not as primitive superstition, but as a sophisticated religious practice deserving anthropological respect. His vivid descriptions of nocturnal ceremonies, visionary states, indigenous symbolism, and profound psychological transformation captured the public imagination almost immediately. Following R. Gordon Wasson's 1957 Life magazine article, María Sabina and the Mazatec community faced a devastating cultural invasion, severe local backlash, and the commercialization of their sacred traditions. An influx of hippies, scientists, and celebrities flooded Huautla de Jimenez, fundamentally disrupting indigenous life. Locals blamed her for bringing outsiders who desecrated the holy mushrooms, leading neighbors to burn down her house. She faced frequent police raids accusing her of drug trafficking, and her son was tragically murdered amid the turmoil. She later lamented that the sacred mushrooms lost their spiritual purity and power once foreigners began using them recreationally rather than strictly for healing. However, stateside, her martyrdom ignited a cultural and scientific revolution. Scientists recognized the possibility of identifying the mushroom's active compounds. Artists, writers, theologians, and philosophers became fascinated by the implications for comparative mysticism. Ordinary readers encountered compelling evidence that visionary sacraments remained active within contemporary indigenous cultures. The article also revived scholarly interest in long-standing debates concerning ancient entheogenic spiritual systems, including Soma, the Eleusinian mysteries, Dionysian religion, and shamanic initiation. Although Wasson himself generally exercised considerable restraint in his interpretations, his work inspired generations of researchers including Carl A.P. Ruck, Richard Evans Schultes, Jonathan Ott, and numerous historians of religion who continued exploring possible relationships between psychoactive plants and sacred ritual across world civilizations. Among those deeply intrigued by Wasson's discoveries was Albert Hofmann, the scientist known for inventing LSD. Recognizing the scientific importance of identifying the active constituents responsible for the remarkable experiences described in Oaxaca, Hofmann collaborated with mycologist Roger Heim of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. Heim successfully cultivated specimens of these sacred mushrooms, allowing Hofmann at Sandoz laboratories to isolate and characterize their psychoactive principles. In 1958, Hofmann announced the successful isolation and synthesis of psilocybin and psilocin, providing science with purified compounds whose molecular structures could now be investigated systematically. This achievement represented one of the greatest milestones in the history of ethnopharmacology, which we will discuss at greater length shortly. For the first time, a sacramental substance preserved through indigenous ceremonial wisdom had been chemically identified without dismissing the cultural context from which it emerged. Hofmann himself consistently acknowledged the indispensable contributions of the Mazatec people and of María Sabina, emphasizing that chemistry alone could never replace the ceremonial systems surrounding these sacraments. He regarded the discovery as evidence that indigenous knowledge and modern science could complement one another rather than exist in opposition. Psilocybin soon became available for psychiatric investigation through Sandoz in much the same way that LSD had earlier entered clinical research, further expanding comparative studies of mystical experience, psychotherapy, creativity, symbolism, and consciousness. The latter half of the 1950s therefore witnessed an extraordinary convergence. Anthropology had rediscovered living sacramental spiritual systems. Chemistry had isolated their active principles. Psychiatry possessed increasingly sophisticated methods for investigating altered awareness. Comparative religion had begun recognizing striking similarities among visionary systems across cultures. Philosophers debated whether psychedelics revealed deeper layers of perception or merely altered ordinary cognition. Esoteric scholars observed recurring symbols that echoed alchemy, Hermetic ascent, Kabbalistic illumination, Gnostic revelation, and Neoplatonic union with ultimate reality. Independently, each discipline came to different conclusions. However, collectively they pointed toward a profound realization. Human consciousness had become a legitimate object of interdisciplinary investigation, one capable of uniting mythology, psychology, ritual, ancient religious practice, and modern empirical laboratory research. As reports of the Mazatec Velada and the sacred mushroom began to spread beyond Oaxaca, they attracted the attention of scientists, intelligence agencies, and government researchers, intersecting with Cold War clandestine programs like MKULTRA, who sought to investigate altered states of awareness. Simultaneously, American authors were documenting their visionary experiences in novels and prose. While the enthusiasm surrounding psychedelic research expanded throughout the latter half of the 1950s, another far more secretive current developed beneath the surface. Governments recognized that chemicals capable of profoundly altering perception, memory, suggestibility, and emotional response might possess strategic value beyond medicine. Following earlier intelligence initiatives such as Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke, the United States Central Intelligence Agency formally established Project MKUltra in 1953 under the direction of chemist Sidney Gottlieb. Unlike academic researchers seeking therapeutic or philosophical insight, MKUltra pursued questions concerning interrogation, behavioral modification, psychological warfare, and the possible manipulation of human consciousness. Numerous universities, hospitals, prisons, and research institutions unknowingly became connected through a complex network of funded projects, many of which investigated LSD alongside hypnosis, sensory deprivation, barbiturates, stimulants, and other experimental techniques. Some participants consented to research, while others received psychedelic substances without informed knowledge or permission, practices now recognized as deeply unethical. The existence of MKUltra revealed an enduring paradox within the history of entheogens. The same compounds capable of inspiring mystical unity, compassion, and psychological healing could also become instruments of coercion when removed from ethical and ceremonial frameworks. Throughout history, sacred knowledge has repeatedly presented humanity with this dual possibility. Fire illuminates and destroys. Language teaches and deceives. Ritual liberates and controls. Psychedelics likewise reflected intention more than inherent morality, reminding future generations that wisdom resides not merely in powerful sacraments, but in the ethical context governing their use. While intelligence agencies pursued secrecy, literature and the arts increasingly absorbed the symbolic language of altered awareness. The Beat generation, emerging during the early 1950s through writers such as Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs, explored questions of authenticity, direct experience, spirituality, jazz improvisation, Buddhist philosophy, and expanded awareness. Although Kerouac himself remained more deeply associated with spontaneous prose, Catholic mysticism, Buddhism, and later with alcohol more than psychedelics during this decade, he moved within intellectual circles increasingly interested in altered awareness and comparative religion. His novels celebrated visionary travel, existential searching, and the rejection of conventional materialism, themes that would strongly influence later psychedelic culture. Ginsberg, who would later become closely associated with psychedelics during the 1960s, already explored visionary consciousness through poetry, meditation, and symbolism associated with William Blake. Burroughs investigated addiction, pharmacology, and psychological experimentation from an entirely different perspective. Collectively, the Beats helped cultivate an intellectual climate receptive to experiences transcending ordinary social conventions. Their fascination with Zen Buddhism, Hindu philosophy, indigenous spirituality, and mystical literature echoed broader developments occurring simultaneously within psychedelic research. Even before widespread psychedelic use entered artistic communities, literature had begun preparing readers to consider consciousness as an appropriate subject of exploration. As government and public interest expanded, so did academic debate surrounding the promises and limitations of psychedelic research. Alongside growing enthusiasm, a small number of scholars began raising important criticisms that would shape the psychedelic field for decades to come. Not every scholar interpreted psychedelics positively. During the 1950s and early 1960s, formal academic opposition to psychedelics was rare because most medical researchers viewed substances like LSD and mescaline with optimism. However, concerns began to emerge from medical experts such as Dr. Sidney Cohen and mainstream psychiatric traditionalists, who warned against non-medical use. While initially an investigator of psychedelic properties in Los Angeles, Cohen grew concerned in the late 1950s about psychological risks, potential psychoses, and self-injuries or worse observed from unsupervised or casual use. Cohen became an early voice within the scientific community, urging strict clinical boundaries to prevent the compounds from being brought into disrepute. Researchers worried that recreational popularization and black market availability would take powerful compounds out of safe clinical settings. Early academic critics highlighted the risks of unguided use, noting that patients could suffer prolonged psychotic reactions, panic, or harm if the drugs were not administered by trained professionals. Mainstream psychiatrists grew skeptical of loose methodologies, self-experimentation, and grandiose claims made by fringe psychedelic enthusiasts. Among the most influential critics was the Oxford scholar of comparative religion, Robert Charles Zaehner. Having devoted extensive study to Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Islam, Christian mysticism, and comparative theology, Zaehner accepted that psychedelics produced extraordinary alterations of awareness, but questioned whether these experiences should automatically be identified with authentic mystical realization. After undergoing mescaline under controlled conditions during the late 1950s, Zaehner argued that chemically induced experiences differed fundamentally from the disciplined contemplative achievements described by saints and mystics. The Oxford professor of Eastern religions strongly attacked the idea that chemical agents could produce authentic mystical or religious experiences. In his 1957 book, Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, Zaehner specifically targeted Aldous Huxley's 1954 pro-mescaline essay, The Doors of Perception, arguing that drug-induced states were merely trivial or unnatural extensions of the mind, rather than genuine union with God. He distinguished between experiences of nature, experiences of the soul, and genuinely theistic unio mystica, maintaining that these categories should not be collapsed into one another. His critiques generated vigorous debate with figures such as Aldous Huxley and later Huston Smith regarding the relationship between pharmacology and spirituality. These discussions remain significant because they encouraged greater philosophical precision. Rather than asking whether psychedelics were simply mystical or non-mystical, scholars increasingly examined questions concerning preparation, ethical transformation, long-term integration, theological interpretation, contemplative practice, and enduring character development. The dialogue demonstrated that the study of entheogens belonged not only to chemistry or psychiatry or psychology, but equally to philosophy, religion, esotericism, and comparative mysticism. In light of this criticism, many scholars, psychiatrists, authors, anthropologists, and spiritual seekers champion the study and exploration of psychedelics. One of these supporters, often called the father of modern ethnobotany, Richard Evans Schultes, spent the 1940s and 1950s fieldworking and documenting the sacred, ritualistic use of hallucinogenic plants by indigenous groups in the Americas, laying the academic groundwork for the 1950s revival. In the 1950s, entheogenic psychedelics represented a monumental psychiatric opportunity for healing and exploring consciousness, set directly against rising social and political fears of mind control, social chaos, and uncontained deviance. Despite these debates, scientific investigation continued to progress at a remarkable pace. The closing years of this decade witnessed pivotal advances in the documentation and exploration of entheogenic mushrooms. As mentioned a moment ago, in 1959, Albert Hofmann and his research colleagues at Sandoz isolated the active psychedelic principles psilocybin and psilocin from Psilocybe mexicana and Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms, making the compounds fully legible to the scientific world, and publishing their landmark chemical findings in the journal Helvetica Chimica Acta. This matters because synthesis is the point at which an isolated natural compound becomes reproducible, comparable, and institutionally usable. In the same year, R. Gordon Wasson and French mycologist Roger Heim published The Hallucinogenic Mushrooms of Mexico, detailing their pioneering ethnomycological expeditions and the ritual use of sacred mushrooms. Wasson returned to the Sierra Mazateca in Mexico alongside Heim to continue field study following the 1958 death of his wife and research partner Valentina. Concurrently, R. Gordon Wasson mounted the high-profile public exhibition titled The Quest for the Divine Mushroom, an Ancient Rite Rediscovered, at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, bringing indigenous entheogenic spirituality into major American cultural spaces. Chronologically, these events close the decade's mushroom arc. Wasson's 1955 ritual encounter, the 1957 public life article, the 1958 isolation of the compounds, and the 1959 publication of their chemistry and ethnomycology, alongside public cultural awareness. The sequence is essential because it shows the rapid movement from indigenous ceremony to public media to laboratory standardization. Simultaneously, researcher Harris Isbell published comparative clinical studies evaluating the mental and perceptual effects produced by psilocybin and LSD in human subjects, including altered perception, hallucinations, and difficulty in habitual cognition, with the effects of LSD reported as significantly more potent than those of psilocybin. Also in 1959, author and counterculture icon Ken Kesey volunteered as an experimental subject taking psychoactive compounds like LSD and psilocybin at the CIA-funded MKULTRA project site at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital and Stanford University, an experience that directly inspired his novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Finally, in 1959, British philosopher Alan Watts ingested LSD-25 in San Francisco with medical researchers, writing that he underwent profound states of awareness corresponding with world mystical literature, detailing these profound encounters in his 1962 book, The Joyous Cosmology. By the end of the 1950s, the major classic psychedelics were becoming a recognized family in Western science: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and psilocin. This helped establish the modern entheogenic landscape. The decade's psychiatric work, literary interpretation, and ethnographic disclosure had all converged into a coherent field. At the same time, the broader cultural and political context remained tense, because the same era also saw CIA interest in LSD through MKULTRA, launched in 1953 and continuing through the decade, dosing unwitting subjects with LSD, testing mind control techniques, and funding extreme psychiatric experiments during the Cold War. That detail matters because it shows that the psychedelic story was never only about healing or spirituality. It was also about secrecy, coercion, and Cold War control. By the decade's end, all the major lines are visible. By 1959, the decade had completely transformed the intellectual landscape surrounding entheogens. With these breakthroughs, the foundations had been laid for an extraordinary new era in the study of consciousness, religion, and ethnobotany. The 1950s brought indigenous wisdom, scientific discovery, and global cultural interest into novel dialogue, setting the stage for the transformations that would define the following decades. The 1950s transformed entheogens into a modern language for mystical experience, and that mattered far beyond psychiatry, because it gave esoteric seekers, comparative religious scholars, and psychedelic philosophers a new vocabulary for discussing revelation, unity, and the sacred. Huxley's influence, especially through his perennialist thinking, helped many readers connect psychedelic states to older mystical traditions in Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and other entheogenic spiritual systems that treat direct experience as spiritually authoritative. The decade also changed the status of indigenous plant knowledge in global history, because mushrooms and other entheogenic spiritual systems were no longer invisible to Western institutions once they entered scientific literature and popular media. That visibility expanded respect for sacred medicines, but it also set the stage for appropriation, extraction, and a long ethical struggle over who gets to interpret and benefit from these spiritual systems. At the same time, the 1950s created the enduring tension between entheogens as sacraments and entheogens as instruments of control, which became one of the central dramas in modern esoteric and psychedelic history. In that sense, the decade did not just introduce new chemicals and sacraments, it reshaped how the modern world imagines mind, spirit, healing, and secrecy. Although the 1960s are remembered as the decade of the psychedelic revolution, nearly every major development that made that transformation possible emerged during the 1950s. R. Gordon Wasson's documentation of the Mazatec Velada introduced psilocybin mushrooms to an international audience. Albert Hofmann isolated and synthesized psilocybin and psilocin, providing standardized compounds for scientific investigation. Researchers explored psychedelics in psychiatry, psychology, and the comparative study of religion, while government programs such as MKULTRA investigated their effects under the pressures of the Cold War. At the same time, anthropologists, ethnobotanists, and historians increasingly recognized that entheogens were central elements of many indigenous ceremonial shamanic systems, rather than isolated curiosities. Literature, philosophy, anthropology, and neuroscience increasingly converged upon a shared realization. The exploration of consciousness required genuine interdisciplinary cooperation. By the close of the decade, the intellectual, scientific, cultural, and political foundations had been established for the unprecedented expansion of psychedelic research, public awareness, and spiritual experimentation that would reshape global entheogenic history throughout the 1960s. In our next video, join us as we explore the entheogenic history of the 1960s. We will discover how the usage of entheogens expanded past laboratories into the hippie counterculture, becoming central to events like San Francisco's Human Be-In, the 1967 Summer of Love, and the 1969 Woodstock Music and Art Fair. Simultaneously, we will see how authors and philosophers like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts mainstreamed the concept of using chemical and botanical catalysts for profound mystical insight and direct communion with divinity. Join us next time as we move from the entheogenic evidence found throughout the 1950s into the cultural freedom movements and legal restriction acts that unfolded thereafter. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants found throughout global spiritual history take us after the so-called swinging 60s? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.